I'm John Buchanan. Now within this video, we're going to take another look at pattern sequencing within Logic Pro, because to be honest, this does really feel like the kind of Pandora's box feature of Logic. Now, don't get me wrong, there are lots of those. Logic's an amazingly capable program. Goodness me, how many chapters are there on this channel already looking at its feature set? And yet every time I go to pattern sequencing, I learn new things and I begin to see new possible musical horizons. And a bit like live loops, one of the advantages of pattern sequencing is that effectively we're working in a non-linear environment. So in other words, rather than just trying to press record and get through the bars and play in the parts that we want, effectively instead what we're doing is we're looking at the sorts of techniques that exist in programming drum machines and hardware drum machines, or indeed in sort of modular synthesis. This idea that what we could do effectively would be to create systems for the notes that we use. And also to kind of split the idea of programming into two separate things, the notes themselves and then little control messages for them that allow us to interrupt those notes in interesting ways. And the subject of this video, after this long rambling intro, I promise I'm getting somewhere with this, is this idea of like advanced randomization. What can we do when we really make randomization a big part of our programming, both for notes and for control messages? Turns out, really interesting things. So what we're going to start by doing, so much so that I've given you both of my index fingers, like that. Exciting. Okay, let's go in. What I've done here is just to configure a little collection of sounds, just 5 of them, by selecting some sounds from the library of options within Drum Machine Designer. So I've opened up an empty new kit. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to add to my 16-step sequence a kick drum. In fact, I've got a couple of different kicks, a clap, a rim shot, and a hat part. I'm going to do this quite quickly. So what we've got here, I think, is a nice big deep kick. And then we've got a sort of smaller one here, which I think is going to be useful to us as well. So what I'm going to do is put in a pattern that kind of does that from a kick perspective. So we've got a little bit of shuffle. Maybe we'll just have one of those on the last 16th notes. I'm going to put a clap, there it is, on beat 3. I think we're going to program quite a busy hi-hat part. And what I'm going to do is to put in a quite busy rim shot part 2, but actually for now I might wait. I'm going to save that part for last. Now there's one more thing that is worth just drawing your attention to, which is that what I want to do is to make sure that there is some swing in this pattern a little bit. Now, if you're interested in doing that when you're working with any sort of pattern sequence, rather than being able to do that from the quantize menu where we would normally select swing values, they're not available because effectively what we need to do is to be applying those swing to individual notes or steps, if you like, within this sequence. So the place where you're going to find swing is here. I can select 8th or 16th notes, and it's the hat part that I want to have swing a little bit. And then what I can do is either just click up here or just click in the middle and just drag up to the value that I want. So I want a little bit of swing in this pattern. Okay, fine. For now, that's going to be good. Now, what do I mean when I talk about randomization? Well, at the moment, nothing is random. I have programmed this pattern. It's doing its thing, and every time it comes back at the end of every single bar is the same because, of course, it's just getting to the end of the sequence and it's coming back the other way around. Now, we know that some options exist in terms of how we can play things back. I've looked at this on the channel before. So for instance, if what I wanted to do was to take the hi-hat part and I had it play forwards and backwards, which is this option here, what's going to happen is that on the way back, it's going to be a different pattern because there isn't going to be a note on the first step. There is a note on the first step here. It's going to play all the way through and then it's going to come back, and the second time round it'll be different. But that still isn't random because, of course, it's just effectively changing the forwards and backwards nature of the way that the sequence plays. But it turns out that there is a randomization option within every single lane, and it's this little logo here. So if I select this option, what's going to happen now is that each of these individual steps is going to be selected at random, and we'll see that. It's going to just dance around on this particular lane, picking out individual steps. And that's fine, and we're certainly getting some variation, but again, it doesn't feel that interesting. And the reason for that is, I think, twofold. Firstly, there are too many hi-hats, and that means that more often than not, it's going to select a square which contains a hi-hat. And that's a problem in its own right, because it just means we get a consistency there. But also, all the hi-hats are exactly the same. I've just made them all exactly the same. I've literally just switched on their squares. So there are a couple of things that we could do to make the randomness of this part a bit more interesting, I think. And the first one of those is that we could vary velocity. If I come into the velocity tab here, what I can do, of course, is to come through and make variations to these so that each one in turn has got its own little value. So now we've got varying velocities, and that's one way of introducing random, because every time it now selects a different step, its velocity is going to be different. There are further ways that we could do that. What I'm going to do is to now come to the idea of a repeat. That allows me to break up any individual note turn it into 2 or 3 or 8 slices. So if we just took 2 of these, one of which we turned into a sort of 2, so it skips and plays twice, and one of which we turn into a triplet, so in other words, it effectively becomes a 3, then again, because it's going to be selected at random, that might be quite interesting. But of course we could do more than this too. So let's come back to the idea of note on and off steps. And I'm also going to randomize the second of the 2 kick drums. So the busier pattern is also going to be randomized. I'm not going to worry about that for the clap part, but what I am going to do is to also now introduce a rim shot part. So firstly, I'm just going to create a few little steps here. This little delay is kind of built into the sound, which is why we're hearing it happen a couple of times. And again, what I'm going to do actually is to strip out a few of these. Again, too many. I've made too many. Too many, Jono. And again, what I'm going to do is to randomize the velocity a little bit. And I'm going to certainly randomize the order of these notes as well. Okay, so we've got a slightly more interesting pattern. For a while there, I was just using the forwards and back version, but it's randomized now. But again, even though we now know that there is some variation, it doesn't feel like a super random pattern. What I want to do is to find a way of being able to introduce something else, which is also going to randomize. And it's this rim shot part that I'm going to focus on, because of course we've got various options here. And this is why Drum Machine Designer is such an amazingly capable, it's not just instrument, but effectively multi-channel instrument, recording device, playback system, modular system, really. It's this amazingly multifaceted, highly capable thing, not just for drum parts, but for synth parts as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to shine a light on just exactly what I mean by that. So far, what we've got within any Drum Machine Designer track is a sort of track stack. The Drum Machine Designer track effectively folds down onto this multi-track arrangement. And the first thing to say, as you know already, is that every single voice therefore gets its own channel of effects. So if I want to focus in on the kick, I want to compress it, EQ it, do anything I like, I can click on the kick track, add those effects here, add sends if I want to for reverbs, delays, and I've got that capability for every single sound within the Drum Machine Designer kit that I build or that I open up. So straight away I've got this amazingly multi-instrument, multi-track project. But of course that provides its own interesting approach from a programming perspective as well. If I just click on the rim shot sound, and I trigger it on my keyboard, now that I'm triggering it on a track on its own right, I can obviously trigger that sample wherever I like. So one thing I could do would be to actually literally record some extra rim shots on this track within this pattern in real time, and it will add to the complexity of the pattern. But if I can record notes, I can also record other things like automation. So if what I wanted to do, let's say, was to have the amount of reverb on this sound grow through the 4 bars of the pattern, I could take the send level to the Space Designer reverb, I could increase it through those 4 bars, and the amount of reverb on this rim shot would increase. And that's fine, but it's not random. So what might we do with random? Well, just because I've got a pattern sequence on the Drum Machine Designer track, it doesn't stop me from having another pattern sequence on just the rim shot track. And rather than this being for notes, it can be for automation parameters instead. I'll show you what I mean. What I'm going to do is to click in bar 5 and a control click here, and I'm going to create a pattern region. And what that's going to do is it's going to open up a brand new step sequencey pattern just for this instrument. And understandably, Logic assumes that I want to record notes for it, but I don't. That isn't what I want to do at all. What I'm going to do instead, before we go any further, is to set up a couple of effects for this instrument. And the first one I'm going to set up is going to be the AutoFilter. Now, I have a feeling that if we take a sound like this and significantly increase its resonance, we might be able to turn it into quite a chirpy little noise. Look at that, it's even self-oscillating. If I turn up the resonance too far, then effectively what happens is the sound starts to make a little noise in its own right. So we're gonna have to be careful with that, but I think if we get that right, we might just be able to make this really liquid little sound coming out of this plugin. I'm gonna turn the envelope shaping down a fair amount. Let's just see what we can do with this noise. Okay, and I think that if we introduce an LFO to this sound as well, maybe over a couple of bars, and we get a little bit of movement into it, we're going to hear even more kind of liquid quality in this sound. Good. Okay, that's a nice start. Now then, what I also want to do is to add a little bit of tape delay. I'm going to come to the delay options, I'm going to come to tape delay, and I'm going to set this up. Now, we've looked at the interesting ways that we can produce kind of comb filtering effects with delays, and we're going to do that again now. I'm going to turn off tempo sync, and I'm going to turn the delay time down to something really short. Let's say, I don't know, just a default value of, let's say, I don't know, 30, 40 milliseconds, something like that. I'm going to open up the frequency range over which this sound can add delays. And what we're going to do is to slightly increase feedback as well. Let's have a listen to this. Okay, so we've had this comb filtering effect before. The moment I start playing around with the delay time at these really short values, we get this amazingly flickery little liquid sound, which I think is really interesting. Now then, wouldn't it be great if what I could do would be to randomly select the delay time and maybe how much of this we actually get to hear. In other words, the wet level of this particular delay effect. In other words, if I turn the wet level down to 0, we get none. And if I turn it up to 60%, we'll get a lot. So that might be quite an interesting parameter to automate, but rather than doing that in kind of a linear way where that parameter rises and falls in a way that it probably would if we were to automate it in a regular way, I want to create a series of on-off switches for that parameter, and I want to be able to vary the amount of delay time as well, and then have Logic through its pattern sequence randomly select those values at various points. Interesting idea, I think. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to our little pattern sequence, which we've created for just this rim shot. And what I'm going to do is to come here, and instead of choosing a note lane, I'm going to come to automation. Now, because we're on the pattern sequence for the rim shot, the effects that I've added for the auto filter and for the tape delay are visible. if I was to do this on the main drum machine designer track and I tried to add automation, I'm not going to find those effects because they don't exist for the pattern that's been created for the drum machine designer track. I need to come to the pattern that I'm creating for this rimshot part. I'm then going to come to automation. And I know that the two parameters that I'm interested in changing both belong to the tape delay. So the first one of those is the wet level, the amount of wet signal that we're hearing at any given moment. I'm going to command an arrow down to make these blocks a little bit bigger so we can see them a bit more clearly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on every single slot where this value could potentially exist. In other words, I want every single square to potentially be an on-off switch for the amount of wet level. And what that means is that as this pattern becomes randomized, it's always going to be selecting a value. Hopefully that makes sense. What I then need to do is to come into the velocity and value button. And now what I need to do is to select whichever ones I want to make not 0. So whenever that's 0%, there's going to be no wet level at all. And that's going to be most of the time. But what I also want to do is to be in a position where maybe a couple of these feature a much more significant level. I'm going to choose 60%, which is where we were when we were listening to it a moment ago. And maybe I'm going to choose another one anywhere. Remember, this is going to be random, so it doesn't really matter where. And I'm going to make that, I don't know, 40%. And those are going to be the only two values that are going to be on. Now, if I let this pattern play through linearly, is that a word? It means that effectively it would switch on at the beginning of beat 1 and it would switch on halfway through beat 2. But this is going to be random and I'm going to do that now. And as a result of that, those two events might happen right next to each other. Who knows? What I'm then going to do is to come back to the automation again, and this time I'm going to come back to tape delay and I'm going to choose the delay time. Now remember, this is the value that I've selected as this really short thing. And in fact, the moment I switch on the delay time lane, I can see that 44 milliseconds, which was the value I selected, is kind of imprinted there, ready for me to manipulate that if I want to. But again, what I need to do first of all is to switch on every single one of those spaces so that a potential value can be accessed every time that happens. Then I can come back here and I can vary them. Now, I never want these to get too long. I'm going to make 44 milliseconds my kind of default value. And again, I might need to make these a little bit bigger to be able to make the changes that I want. I don't think make them longer is going to be a problem. Let's see if we can get down below there. This isn't going to be the easiest interface to manipulate, but okay, it's kind of working. So I'm going to make sure that nothing is over 100 milliseconds. And what I'm also going to do is to make sure that a couple of them are really short. It looks like the lowest value I can sort of select is around 6, like this, and we're in good shape. So I'm going to just make sure that, having just said nothing would be above 100, that one's above 100. Sloppy work, Jono. What I'm going to do is to select a couple of other values here as well. Oh, that was a really nice little one there for a moment. 0.6 milliseconds. Okay. Feels almost dangerous. So effectively, I'm just going to go through and just choose these values at random, adding random to the random, but just to make sure that we've got a conflicting or undulating set of values here. And again, remember, these are going to be selected randomly. So it doesn't matter whether or not I end up even with a little sort of ramp almost of values next to each other. I'm going to leave a couple of these exactly where they were at 44 milliseconds, and everything else can just be a little bit smaller than that. And again, those values I'm going to randomize to make sure that they're being selected just however Logic wants to select them. Now, what does that mean? Well, just to remind you, it means that when I press play, every once in a while, one of the wet values that isn't 0 is going to be selected. And at that moment, that is going to correspond to whichever randomly selected delay time happens to be active at that moment too. And that sounds like this. I really like that. It's subtle, but it's interesting. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, I want more of that. Okay, well, in that case, just switch on a couple more places where that random can happen. So, for example, what I'm going to do here is to make a wet value that is let's say, I don't know, 70%, even louder. And what I am going to do is to find one of these values, and I am going to turn it up so that the delay is a lot longer. Let's suppose I select, 373 milliseconds. And over here, I'm going to select one that is nearer half a second long. And that means that if it just so happens that that value is selected when one of the wet values is on, we're going to hear a more obvious long-lasting delay. I think that's quite interesting. In the context of the whole thing, let's have a listen to this now. So I can hear that when I push resonance above about 65%, it begins to self-oscillate and I need to be careful. But I have pushed it up a little bit more and I've raised the overall cutoff. Now there are a couple of things to say. We've now got randomization of two really key parameters within the tape delay. But what I've also got is movement in this sound coming through the LFO for the way that this sound is being processed from a filtering perspective before that tape delay. And none of that is being randomized. So we've got movement that's coming through the AutoFilter, and then we've got a different type of movement that is coming from this kind of step effects based randomization of the tape delay plugin. Now, we've only looked at two separate plugins in channel. I could add a reverb, and I could decide to automate or whatever I just said a moment ago, the decay time, so that effectively the reverb could go from being really short to really long randomly every once in a while. I could turn off some of these steps so that effectively we're calling on a different collection of randomizations. You can see the point that I'm trying to make, and this is just for the rim shot. If I wanted to do the same thing for the clap part or the kicks or the hi-hats or any other instrument within my Drum Machine Designer multi-track, all I've got to do is to create a pattern sequence for that lane, pick the parameters that I want to, and randomize them. This is an extraordinarily capable, interesting thing. Let's just listen to it in context with the synth part as well. Just added a tremolo to that part so that effectively we're getting some stereo movement before the tape delay. I just think that the capabilities of adding detail to the ways in which we can work and build sequences like this is just enormous. And in fact, I'm going to be bold and say that this is going to be the first video in a new series around pattern sequencing and the capabilities of that. We're just looking at one little part of some drum programming. Imagine performing some of this technique around the idea of working with synth parts. We can get into many of the things that people reach for modular synths to do. The idea of pattern sequencing in a whole series of ways, all of the kind of plugins that rely on that kind of technology. And it's looking us in the face, I think, as far as all of these capabilities are concerned. The pattern sequencing goes way beyond just being able to program drum beats and takes us into some really interesting territories. And we're going to explore those. But for now, go and have a look at working with randomized automated parameters. I think this is just an amazing kind of tip of the iceberg moment.